Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our ongoing podcast series on Michael and my reflections of 2020. This week, we have turned our attention to a theme that we've talked about a lot in the last year, a theme that we think we've seen on display a lot in a lot of various ways and in a lot of various places. The idea of fear, something all of us live with, something that is well attested to in our faith language and in our scripture, and a reality that has been somewhere between annoying and paralyzing for people during this last year or so. And depending on who you are, you may have a different experience. You may have a different relationship with fear. Maybe in many ways we would talk about something like anxiety, which is low-grade fear, all the way up to really kind of terror. And that has probably, fortunately, been less common for most of us. But I suspect, Michael, that somewhere along the line, everybody has been at least nervous or anxious or agitated about something or other over the past 12 months.
There's not many emotions, if any, that people dislike as much as fear. Real fear, not the kind of cheap fear that you go to the Halloween haunted house or whatever, the sort of commercialized fear. I mean, our real fears, the things that drive our behaviors, that live within us, that tell us that it's not going to be okay. You're not safe. You're not going to be able to flourish. Your family isn't. It's not just the worry, though I think many of us experience that. When we're driven by these negative things within our own hearts and souls, we find them taking us in some dangerous and some dark places. And of course, the obvious elephant in the room is the fear directly of the virus. And in fact, there was a sense in which there was a concerted effort, I think, very early on in the virus to make it clear that this is something worth being concerned about at the least. And I think you could make an argument in some cases it was worded, this is something worth being afraid of. And so that dominated attention. Of course it did, as entire businesses shut down, as churches and as courthouses and as schools all simultaneously tried to figure out how we're going to navigate this thing. The elephant in the room was that there is a thing out there worth being afraid of. And a lot of people, 12 months later, are incredibly tired of talking about that particular fear, and for lots of reasons. I think what needs said at the beginning of this conversation, Clint, is that's not the only fear that we've all dealt with this year. That has been a significant driving force, but there's been a lot of other fear to spread around.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that fear has lived in a lot of places for a lot of people. Whether or not one is quote unquote afraid of the virus, I have heard many people express fears over other things. Fear of the economy, fear that my child might lose their senior year, their junior prom, the vacation we were going to take. We're not always talking about abject terror here. Fear lives in lots of places. And there are people who have said, well, I'm more concerned about this thing. I'm more anxious about the way that this is being used. I'm more anxious about the impact this is going to have on people financially or in terms of their employment. But the point of that is, I think the point that we want to try and make is that throughout this experience that we've had together, fear-based conversation and fear as a reality has been present for most people in one place or another. Fear has been something that I think we've all rubbed shoulders with in this year that we've been through.
Yeah, I don't think this is entirely fair. The statement I'm about to make, some fears are deeply rooted in reality and they need taken seriously. But there's a whole host of fears, and I think I would make the argument that the majority of them that we experience in our life where we live, where the fears that we experience tend to be things that we have, for whatever reason, not truly sort of made the connection between what the fear actually is versus the threat that it has for us. I think there's a lot of things in our life that we worry about that the worry has no impact or ability to change. And the point I want to make as we sort of address this topic is recognizing no one wants to think about fear. No one wants to dredge up the deep, dark, difficult stuff that drives us. But Clint, if we don't, we're in danger of being driven by fear rather than driven by faith. And when we get towards the end of the conversation, we're going to see how faith is a constructive mechanism that helps us build a life of intentionality and to receive a life by grace that reflects who God intends for us to be. What I think is essential to say at the outset of this conversation is that fear is a counterfeit motivation. Fear is almost never constructive. We can sometimes turn fear in constructive ways, but if left unchecked, fear tends to move us in negative spaces. It doesn't help us build a life of intentionality. It causes us to turn and run for the hills. And I think that it's important as people who are now seeking to sort of get our head above water a little bit and begin to ask the questions of what have we learned and how can we grow. I think that fear is a difficult, though important conversation and topic to tackle, because if we want to be people who reflect the goodness, grace, love, peace of Jesus Christ, we have to be able to look this thing in the eye and to truly address it for what it is.
I think we also tend toward the assumption that fear is always bad, that fear is always negative. There is a sense in which a healthy dose of fear is not always a bad thing. So, for instance, I have been, for part of this time in the midst of COVID, afraid to go visit certain people because I know those people are vulnerable. I know that those people could be the kind of people who really get hit hard by this virus. And so when I have chosen not to do that, it is a reaction to that fear that I don't want them to be ill, and I certainly don't want to have played a part in that. And I'm guided by that fear. And so we can talk about rational fear and irrational fear. And not all fear is bad. Not all fear is unhelpful. Sometimes that voice of caution that speaks to us is important. And if we were to ignore our fears completely, we would be in danger. That would put us in jeopardy regularly. But if we were, on the other hand, to listen to every possible fear, that would paralyze us. And so as people, especially as people of faith, the task really becomes navigating our fear in such a way that we don't let it have the reins, but we use it in order to make it productive. And I think that has gotten lost. That sort of distinction, that sort of nuance has not been a part of some of the conversations we've had recently over are you afraid and what are you afraid of?
Yes, and that's why this conversation follows the previous, because fear does have an intimate and challenging connection to division. When you think about our human relationships with one another, when we find ourselves in a place where we feel comfortable, when we feel safe, when we feel like another person is being transparent with us, we do not have fear about being in their presence. When we have become convinced that we don't know that person's intention and that they may pose a risk to us in whatever way that might be, that could be physical, but I think more likely in our experience, it is that they speak in a way that feels threatening, or they seem to have an opinion or worldview that does not correspond to our own, then we begin to feel fear. We begin to feel like we're going to be in a situation that's not comfortable. And I don't know if this is true, Clint. You may know if this is true. I once read that the origin of the handshake was this idea of showing an empty hand to communicate the idea that you come with no ill intention for this other person. And clearly, we've lost handshakes this last year, both physically and I think in some ways symbolically. we don't have that sort of trust for the other as we would like to have, I think, culturally and certainly as people of faith. And so what lives in those margins then is the back of our mind, this fear that I can't trust you, that you're not on my team, that we're not all working toward the same goal. And to whatever extent that continues to grow from an ember to a full fire, we begin to see that division actually, I think, fostering. It's like a petri dish for this background motivation, this sort of negative space, which is this fear that we are indeed not trustworthy to one another. And I think that becomes the foundation bed for some of these struggles that we have dealing with fear.
Yeah, I think once those lines get drawn, then fear is often used as an accusation. And I think we have lived through that to some extent. I had an experience a couple of months into this pandemic of going into a store wearing a mask and ran into somebody who's a friend who said, something along the lines of, oh, you're one of those guys. I said, what? And he said, well, you're afraid. Are you afraid of getting sick? And I had to think about that because I didn't think that I was. And as I thought about it, I mean, nobody wants to be sick, but I don't think that it was that at all. It was that reality that I didn't want to make anyone else sick. But it's interesting that the immediate association for someone who believed they stood in a different place than I did was that I was afraid and they were not afraid. And it was very much an accusation and there was no understanding in it. There was no trust in it. And it was an interesting moment. I thought a lot about it. The idea that one of the kind of insinuations that got lobbed back and forth a lot is, oh, you're just afraid. Oh, you're just operating from fear. And when that starts, I think it makes it difficult to kind of have, a very helpful kind of conversation. It makes it hard to make progress in regard to communication. And I think there's been so much of that. I think we saw it again in the political realm recently. The idea that I'm afraid the political system isn't fair, isn't just, and others were not afraid. And so again, we've all had some level of anxiety over something, and yet when we use fear as an accusation against the other, it really only serves to widen those gaps between us. And I was going to say I don't think that's helpful. I actually think I know that's not helpful.
I think one could make an argument that there are two different kinds of accusations. There's an accusation that invites further dialogue and exploration, and there's another accusation that essentially says, I know the truth and I'm putting it on you. And I think that it's the latter in that circumstance. You had been assessed as being someone who was performing this action from fear, though there are many cases in which you can make a statement. This happens in courtrooms all the time. You make a proposition and then two sides debate to see which idea comes out of the mix. What's different between those two is that fear is present in both, but fear can drive one forward to substance and the other drives you nowhere substantial. And let me tease out what I mean there. I think that fear is so often an emotional response to things that are happening around us, and it's not really thoughtful. And I am a living example of this. I'm particularly, in lots of areas of my life, I'm an optimist. When it comes to managing money, I am a pessimist to the 10th degree. And I just assume everything financial is going to go wrong. And as you know, if you're managing money, you have to take some risk. You have to make some choices to extend yourself. That's the best way to sort of manage risk over the long term. But if you could convince my heart of that, I would love it, right? but it's not rational. It's not thoughtful. I can confess to my wife when she says, that's not a logical thing to think or believe. I say, I know you're right, but I still feel afraid of the possible outcome. That is not a real opportunity to open dialogue, to self-exploration, to ask the question, am I afraid, or is it something else? I do think that fear can drive us into more substantive waters. I do think we can ask the question, well, am I afraid, and what am I afraid of? Because though the mask in that circumstance may represent to that person fear, it may mask for themselves their own places of fear where they're making choices that have not been thought through, that they assume and put on others as fear. I not knowing this person or this circumstance. I just think that we are very quick, as we are often to do as humans, to point fear at others as if it's a light that illumines something about them, without recognizing that it's the very fear that lives inside us that drives us to see it that way in the other. And I think we would be wise, and it would be something very advisable for us to take a pause and to ask ourselves some questions about that.
Not to get overly deep here, Michael, but I have, in the course of, working for the church and serving as a pastor, had occasion to visit with many people who had either found out that they were going to die or who were in the process of dying. And one of the questions I think a pastor has to ask in those moments is, are you afraid? But that's asked as, do you have fear, and how can we talk about it? Is there something we can address here? Right. Can you confess fear so that we can have a conversation about why you may not need to be afraid or why you are afraid? And that's very different than, are you afraid, as an accusation. So it is important where it comes from internally to be interested in another person's fear. If we're using it to dismiss them, then I think, or if we're even using the idea of fear to dismiss them, then I think we need to be more, we need to stop and perhaps think about what it would mean to be compassionate, what it would mean to be understanding. You know this. I recently managed to stick a rusty piece of metal in my hand. I called the doctor, and in the nurse's words, you haven't had a tetanus shot in 1,000,000 years. And so I went in for a tetanus shot. Now, I have almost zero fear of getting tetanus. I mean, realistically, the chances that I end up being the one guy in however many hundreds of thousands that gets tetanus in America is almost zero. But I went and got the shot because the people who know those things tell me that's what I should do, right? And so it is interesting. I just think it helps to realize there's more than one vantage point to look at things. And sometimes if we'll allow ourselves to take that other perspective, we may see something different, and it may not look the same. And at that point, we may be able to speak into someone's fear in a positive way instead of speaking about their fear in a negative way, which I think is the calling of Christian. Dozens and dozens of times the scripture uses the word, be not afraid. It's one of the most common greetings that Jesus uses to people who are somehow always afraid of him because he's doing things that they don't understand. And over again, Jesus says, fear not. And rarely, if ever, is that accusation. It's almost always invitation. You don't need to be afraid. There is a truth beyond your fear. There is a meaning and a depth behind your fear. Let's talk about that instead. And I think that's a more positive approach.
It is about every couple years I circle back around to the conversation with high school youth. And it is always interesting to see students respond when we talk about Jesus. And I always pose the question, if Jesus walked into the room here today, what would it feel like? And of course, students immediately turn to, it would be great. I would feel loved. I would feel like he's with me, and I'd feel like I get to ask him all these questions. It would be a huge celebration and joyful and a party. And then we turn to the New Testament, and I point out all of the times when Jesus' presence actually created fear and anxiety, how the people around him actually got their backs stiffened up and they began running away from him as opposed to running to him. And this is not intuitive. As people of faith, when we live our lives centered on this person, Jesus Christ, as we worship every Sunday with this idea of raising him up and seeking for ourselves to be lessened, it seems anti-intuitive that Jesus's immediate response of those who would come into his presence would be fear. But think of it for just a moment. Jesus represented a power that was completely beyond theirs. When they met Jesus, they met one who wasn't particularly interested in their games, the religious leaders especially. When Jesus was in the midst of the storm, he wasn't fussed about it. It wasn't really a problem. When the disciples were worried the people would revolt because they're hungry, Jesus knows, well, we're just going to get them food, right? There's a reality in which Jesus' life and presence as the Son of God shows us what it looks like to live a life rooted in God's reality, God's truth. It is a non-anxious place and way to live. But when that way intersects our lives with all of our seeking to strive and try to protect ourselves and our interests and our families, things that aren't necessarily always bad, but those interests can often conflict with who Jesus is and what he calls us to be as people. And so therefore, I think we see in this scriptural account that sometimes people become afraid of the very one who came to liberate us from our deepest fears.
It's interesting. We most often, if you asked people what the antidote to fear is, I think the answer you would hear most often would be courage, bravery, or strength. But I think spiritually speaking and biblically speaking, that answer is more often peace, purpose, love, compassion, commitment. I mean, there are numerous ways to sort of leave fear behind. And when Jesus said, fear not, he was never telling the disciples, be braver,
right,
be stronger. What he was saying is that as you come to know me, the reasons you think you have to be afraid will lessen. And the place in you that knows peace instead of anxiety will increase. And I think, hopefully that's the journey we are all pursuing. And one of the things that matters as people of faith is that we're not pursuing that simply for ourselves, but we're trying to share that with others as well. We're literally called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, the ones who make peace. And peace is one of the best ways to combat fear that we know of.
And I think as people of faith, a practice that we seek to bring to this is the practicing of humility. And what we need to recognize is where fear does actually exist in us. As a high schooler, I spent actually a lot of time, I really loved documentaries, history, and so I watched a lot and read a lot about World War II. And a thing that struck me about some of the heroes of World War II is when they came to be interviewed and asked, how did you do that thing? Weren't you terrified? The answer 9 times out of 10 was, yeah, I was absolutely terrified. I could not imagine doing it. But then when the moment came, I somehow just did what needed done. And I wonder if there's not some real truth in first starting with the recognition that to be human is to have fear. We don't need to pretend like fears are something that we can beat down and that we can get pushed out of our lives, because the truth is, the more that we try to push it to the fringe, the more it operates there without us being aware that it exists. I think that the first confession needs to be, Lord God, help me in my fear. Help me recognize my disbelief when that exists. Help me to trust you. And if we can pray that prayer of confession, I think then some of the good news of what God has done for us and how that transforms our life and experience can then follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are a person that's prone to carry a significant amount of fear or anxiety, there are, I think back about a year ago, Michael, we were working our way through the Enneagram. And one of the things that sort of personality accounting system or personality identification system, that might not be a fair label to the Enneagram, but one of the things that it helps us see is that we do have some things that we're, kind of lean toward. We do have some kind of general tendencies inside of ourselves, each of us. And for those who are prone to anxiety, this is a real struggle, an almost daily battle. And it may help to realize that most of what we fear doesn't end up happening. Most of the things we worry about don't come to pass, fortunately. But for those who carry a great deal of anxiety, the bad news of 2020 has been there's been an almost limitless supply of places to put it and places to invest it. There have been just chance after chance, multitude of chances to be afraid of this thing, to be anxious about that thing. And I don't think that has anything to do with anyone with what they thought of COVID or I mean it doesn't matter, political perspective, religious perspective. That if you are a person prone to anxiety, it has found you in this season.
Absolutely, and it has probably found you if you're not prone to anxiety. But for those people in particular, Clint, I do think this has been a crippling season. The thing that has made it, I think, so unbelievably devastating is both the isolation and also the images of fear. I mean, all of this has happened simultaneously. The separation, the awareness of suffering that's happening, even though that we know we may not be in the middle of the room at that moment. And then we see images on TV being broadcast from news, whether that is from Minneapolis or that's from Washington, D.C. We see these images that get seared on our mind where we see fear being lived out in flesh and blood. And in that moment, I don't know that we could live without it affecting our existence, without us asking questions. Is this the world that I live in? Is this the kind of world that I want to live in? And regardless of where you find yourself in the divisions that we talked about last week or trying to navigate somewhere in between, the struggle is much of those conversations, even on opposing sides of all of the issues, political, social, economic, medical, all of these, not all, I'm sorry, I'm overstating my case, many of these are driven by fear as opposed to other better sources. And fundamentally, I do think the Christian faith does compel us to build the foundation of our lives on something more solid and foundational than simply the fear that overwhelms us of what could be or what might be or what we can imagine happening. This isn't enough to build a life on, says our faith. And I think we should be humble enough to recognize that and seek to build our life on something more strong.
In the near future, you and I are going to have a conversation about how media in all of its forms has functioned during this previous year. But for now, I just want to lay out some of the polarities that fear has taken. So on one hand, you have fear of COVID. On the other hand, you have the fear of getting a vaccine. You have the fear of anarchy. You have the fear of the government taking over. You have the fear that I could get sick. You have the fear that this is being used to enforce new policies. Whatever camp a person might land in, one thing I would challenge you to do is to listen within wherever you get your news, wherever you read on the internet, whatever your Facebook friends tell you. It doesn't matter. I would challenge you, though, to listen for what are my people afraid of? What is it that my people are expressing anxiety about or struggling with right now, because I can almost guarantee it. If you listen carefully, you will find that it's there. You will find the undercurrent. Part of how we communicate in this day and age at that meta level of media is fear-driven and fear-based. And we're not, almost no one, I would even argue no one is exempt from it.
Yeah, and there will be some interesting sort of notes that we can come to in that future conversation. But suffice it to say for this conversation, I do think that we should be challenged as people of faith to not move too quickly to absolving ourselves from this experience. We are fish that have been swimming in this water, and we have been eating, sleeping, breathing, dreaming in some of this stuff. And it's going to affect our outlook and our perspective in life. And I was reading just recently, Clint, a piece where a Christian pastor, theologian, was making an argument that as Christians, we need to be shaped in our imaginations, how we view our world, what we think about ourselves. We should be shaped by this image of the table of Christ, the communion table. What do we put on the table? We put these simple items, bread and juice, bread and wine, right? But it symbolizes that regardless of how many people there are, there's enough for them here, that they can come and get what they need at the table of Christ. That ultimately it's a symbol of abundance. And what I would point to in your comment, Clint, is so many of our tribes, our groups, we are driven by fear of the other taking something that belongs to us, as opposed to driven by the heartfelt spiritual desire to share the abundance, that there is more than enough for all of us. That the idea that the love of Christ does not get divided as it's spread with other people. It actually grows in the same way that a parent doesn't lose love for one child when they have another, right? We, in the love and promise and truth of Christ, have nothing to fear because God has enough for all of God's creation. But yet, we live in a moment in which we are truly tempted every day, sometimes multiple times a day, to believe the narrative that there isn't enough and that we must defend something from others, which is really not the biblical Christian image of what God has done for us.
Yeah, and if you are a person prone to fear, you might find yourself kind of thinking in this conversation, well, yeah, I mean, fear not. That sounds great, but how do you do that? How does that happen? And of course, part of that answer is practical. Part of that answer is psychological. To first ask the question, what am I afraid of? If you could boil that anxiety down to the single thing it points to, what is it in this moment that I fear? And then you have to ask the follow-up question, maybe with yourself, and perhaps this is a place to engage others. Is that a rational fear? Is that reasonable? I remember as a child, my brother came home one day, I was probably in middle school, and he was convinced that he had had some disease that they had read about in school. Well, it was located only in a small people group in Africa. And we are not African, nor have we been to Africa. And so trying to convince my brother that he, in fact, could not have this particular disease when he was convinced that he had it. He just knew he had it, right? So is this fear that I can identify, that I can label, is it reasonable? And if it's reasonable, that tells you something about the behavior or the direction you might take to avoid it. If it's not reasonable, then we move toward this idea of how do I use faith? How do I allow faith to be a tool that speaks to my fear and my anxiety? And there are lots of things that the Christian faith brings to that conversation that I think are helpful.
Very much. I think a question that all of us would want to ask is, can I imagine someone who's not afraid of this thing? And why aren't they afraid of it? And in the moment where we can't answer that question, that's a red flag that it's time to stop and to do some reflection, some confession, some prayer. Because ultimately, we often find ourselves isolated in fear. We find ourselves closed off. And as people of faith, that cuts literally against the grain of how God made us. That God intends for us to be a communal people. And the only way to live in right community with one another is to, first of all, start in right relationship with God, to receive this gift of grace that transforms our heart, and that should ultimately remind us that there is no fear even in death, as the Apostle Paul says, right? And so it is then that heavenly connection, that up and down vertical relationship that enables the horizontal relationship with one another. And we can only live in right relationship with one another if we're not afraid of one another, if we can trust one another, if we can trust the Spirit of God who binds us together. And this is the classic example of easier said than done. I mean, ultimately, the human work as it relates to relationship, church, transparency, and trust is one that has to be lived out in the day-to-day. It's not just philosophical. You can talk about it, but the hard work comes when we need to engage with someone who's radically different, who makes us feel uncomfortable, to address the fears that we have and ask someone else, is this a fear that you share? And if not, help me understand how you're somewhere else. I think these kinds of relationships are central to what we see as reflected in the scriptures of what it means to be people of faith, centered in the person of Jesus Christ. And we can't get there if we're going to carry fear with us into the door.
Absolutely. Scripture, you mentioned, Michael, Scripture is a wonderful tool, particularly the Psalms, the Gospels. I think when we have moments of anxiety, when we are tense, when we are afraid, there are some very helpful reasons to turn to the Scripture. It moves our focus from self to God. Prayer has a way of doing the same thing. I think, again, if we can do the work to name our fear and face it, it then becomes a powerful tool to pray that fear, to hand that fear over to God, to say, this thing is on my mind. This thing is filling my heart with fear. This thing is making it difficult for me to see past it, and I need some help. And I think that prayer is a wonderful tool. Gratitude is always functioned within the church, has always functioned within the church as a good way to push back fear. The idea that this thing I'm afraid of lives out there, and it keeps me blind to the many ways in which God has been good to me, that God has blessed me. So taking the time and making the effort explicitly to be thankful for the blessings in my life is another tool. We have covered some other things in past podcasts. We'd be happy to, maybe point in that direction. But I think maybe sometimes it gets overlooked, but part of the human story of people of faith is that fear is one of our big nemesises. And so the church has given a great deal of thought to what it means to try and pursue our faith and to live a life largely without being crippled by our fears. And so we bring a lot to that conversation as Christians, and we should not forget that.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, some of the saints that I've had the privilege of knowing in my life have come to the end of their lives and have said to me, I'm not afraid. And there's a sacredness of that honest statement, that ability to say that I am firmly convinced that whatever lies on the other side of this life is not a thing for me to fear. And quite frankly, that's a rare gift. Fear is a rampant reality in the world in which we live. And the people who have committed themselves to the faith, who have learned and who have been gifted with the presence of the Spirit to slowly over time, to truly believe the promise that we've been given as the people of faith, they have come to see and experience that there is nothing to fear if Jesus is Lord and Jesus is for us. And that is the central conviction of the good news, is that Jesus has done for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. And I think, to your point, Clint, the church has not only given a lot of thought to the issue of fear as it relates to the Christian life, but the church has been consistent, and I would say universal in its voice, that Christians have no place in putting up with fear reigning. We have no place in expecting that we have to live lives filled with fear. We have real agency as people of faith. Now, if our orientation is to worry, if our orientation is to anxiety, I'm not sure that I'm saying that you will ever be able to scrub that completely. But we do have agency. We don't live and wallow in a world of fear. And so I think one really practical encouragement I might have for you is if you find yourself right now living with a mid to high grade level of anxiety and worry and fear, maybe even more than what you're sort of used to, I think that there's a helpful spiritual practice for me in taking a personal self-assessment of what are the things that I'm bringing into my life right now. And almost inevitably, Clint, I can identify one or two things, and if I'm going to be incredibly honest, most of the time they live on screens or in a book. I found something that I'm reading or thinking about or watching that is distilling and really sort of inserting into my mind and thought and spirit these topics, these fears, these worries. And ultimately, if I can identify the thing and say, you know what, this might be it, and I cut it out, and then 2 weeks later, I don't feel that fear, I think I found the thing that needed rooted out. And I think often we can find in our life a source of fear that we are nourishing whether we have been aware of it or not. And a little bit of time reflecting, identifying, and experimenting with, maybe I'm not going to watch that TV channel anymore can go a long ways if that's the thing that's sort of feeding the fire.
I think that's really good advice, not just to identify the fear, but maybe the background of it. Where does it come from? Why am I fixated or focused on this particular thing in this moment? Is it this fear helping me? Is it in any way motivating me? Is it challenging me? Is it legitimate? Is it pushing me to a better practice of some sort? Or is it simply trying to hold me back? Is it only weight that I'm carrying? And if we can identify that and how it got there, then I think we do have a better opportunity to maybe consider what it would look like to move forward without it. And I'm impressed, Michael, whenever I have those conversations. You mentioned the saints, and that's a strange word in a Presbyterian context. It just means people who impress us with their faith. And whenever I have asked that question to someone on their deathbed or considering the reality of their death, and I ask them, are you afraid? And they can say honestly, no. I am always struck in that moment. I'm always humbled. I'm always grateful for that example that those people give us, that can somehow in those moments where by any reasonable standard, yes is an acceptable answer, and they say, no, I don't find that helpful here. Fear doesn't have to have a place here with me right now. And that's a wonderful encouragement to any among us who might carry a lot of anxiety. You do have in Christ an invitation to let go of it. And we understand that's not easy. We understand that we all struggle with that in one way or another. But it is a beautiful invitation that Jesus says you don't need to carry that. I'll take that for you. I'll take that from you. And that's not a one-time thing. That's not a switch that gets flipped and then there's no more anxiety for the rest of your life. That's an ongoing part of our faith. It's an ongoing journey as we walk the path of Christ to be reminded over and over and over again, I got this. I'm involved. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. And perhaps that's why Jesus has to keep saying it over and over again in the gospel story. We need to hear it because we so often forget.
What has happened is we found ourselves back at the very place where we began this conversation. You began, Clint, with the reminder that so often we think that the solution to fear is strength, it's courage, it's muscling through. And far too many of us have bought that lie, that if we are experiencing anxiety and fear, the way forward is to stuff it down and to push through. And ultimately, the invitation of Jesus Christ is to give to him the fears that cripple us so that we might receive a life that is abundant and free. And if we are able to stop and pause and for a moment look in the eye of the thing that truly unsettles us, and friends, make no mistake, I'm not pretending that this is an easy thing or that it could be done alone or that it won't take time. But if we can intentionally look at the thing that we are convinced is too great for us and we offer that to Christ instead of trying to fight it ourselves, we find in that over and over this letting go and a receiving of a new strength and a new kind of life and a new kind of courage that from our current vantage we could not possibly have. And there's a sense in which this is just plain and simple gospel. That this is the faith 101, and yet it's a fundamental of the faith that I think we do have to return to over and over and over again, because it's a fundamental I think we just misplace in the lives that we live and the moments that we have. We have to return back to that promise that it is the giving up of these things that enables us to live through them in the Spirit of Christ by God's blessing and grace.
Absolutely. Faith pushes out fear, and that's not criticism. If you have fear, it's not to say that you don't have faith. It's a reminder to all of us that the way forward in our fear is to focus on our faith instead. That as we do that, we find that fear has less and less room because we've given our attention, we've given our energy, and we've given our focus to faith instead. And as we do that, we are blessed again with that invitation from Jesus, fear not, which is not just a commandment. It is a kind of commandment, but it is also, and more graciously, an invitation. It is a pathway to let go of some of our fear. And we want to be thankful. We want to thank you for having some of this conversation with us. In a few minutes, we're going to continue this conversation with the live portion. We'll give you some time to get logged on and ready for that. And we want to continue to think together about how fear impedes us, how it makes our life difficult, and how we might be able to move forward in such a way that we experience less of it, or at least that we are less affected by it.
Thanks, friends, for joining us for this conversation and being with us as we seek to reflect on 2020 and continue to seek to allow Christ to transform us in the midst of the things that have happened and the lessons that we've learned.